good evening specifically to all our public servants, to those who are listening and viewing us on social media, and those who are listening in the diaspora. A pleasant evening to you. We just want to say good evening to all the working class, whether you work privately or publicly. Pleasant evening to you. And I hope that we would have had a productive day today. So, welcome to our joint press conference, which would be held by the Public Service Union, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Public Service Union, the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Teachers Union, and the Police Welfare Association. I am your moderator for today, Shelley Ann Alexander Ross, the Public Relations Officer for the SVG Public Service Union. And today we will be discussing or talking about the proposed amendments to the Public Health Act of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the Medical Officers Act. Joining us today, we have the heads of the union and the Police Welfare Association. To my right, we have Mr. Elroy Boucher. He is the president of the Public Service Union. Mr. Brenton Smith, the president of the Police Welfare Association, and Mr. Oswald Robinson, who is the president of the SVG Teachers Union. We also all have our legal counsel with us. To my immediate left, Mr. Israel Bruce, who is the counsel for the Police Welfare Association, and we have Zita Banwell and Mr. Jomo Thomas, who is here to represent the Teachers Union and the Public Service Union. We are all aware that the issue of mandatory vaccine is more or less the object of a heated debates all around the world, and many countries are trying or proposing compulsory vaccination. And so, as unions, and in the case of the Police Welfare Association, we are here to represent our workers when we think that their rights and their freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and alike are being trampled on, and it's our obligation basically to address these issues. So today we will be talking about that, discussing the issue. We're going to hear from the legal end, and we are going to hear the discussion from the heads of the unions. They will present their case first, so they will speak first, and then the lawyers will speak after. And after, we would entertain any questions or concerns that our members will have. So we are going to give over now to Mr. Boucher. He will start the ball rolling and make his presentation.
Thank you, Shelley Ann. And Mr. Good evening to the media and all other persons who are here, not from the media, but present here to listen to this press conference. Good evening to all workers who are listening to us tonight, whether you're listening through Bill News Network, Asbot News, or is it CMC? I'm not sure if it's also streaming live. But wherever you are listening to this press conference, pleasant good evening. Now, we are here this afternoon because of amendments that have been proposed by the government, amendments to the Public Health Act. And let me just briefly state them so that we can bring context to the conversation. And I know our lawyers, of course, would address these issues in their legal remit. Section 27B. So what will be amended? Section 27B of the Public Health Act speaks to persons who are exempted from orders made under Section 27A, 3G, and H. And it says the person who makes a statement in writing that any person that persons believe that medical treatment for the prevention of or cure of the disease is prejudicial to that person's health, or that the person's beliefs are opposed to it, and furnishes that statement to the health officer, and be a child or ward of any such persons. So those are the exemptions within the current act. But that is to be replaced, given the amendment put forward by the government. That is to be replaced. That entire section is deleted, and the following section is inserted. A person is exempt from an order under 27A, 3H, if the person produces a certificate signed by the medical practitioner approved by the chief medical officer certifying that the medical treatment for the prevention or cure of the disease is not advisable on medical grounds. So all of the exemptions, the right to conscience, those have been stripped. The exemption for children, that has also been removed. The other section 43B of the Public Health Act, which is being amended, and the word voluntary immunization, the word voluntary is to be replaced, and all you will have is an immunization. So voluntary will be taken out. Those amendments, as a union, we are extremely concerned with those stated amendments to the Public Health Act as the government has put forward. These amendments, in our view, infringe on the right to conscience, beliefs, and thoughts, a right which guarantees our freedom to choose what goes into our bodies and that of our families. The government has embarked on amendments that has the potential to impact the lives of workers, other Vincentians, and our children. These amendments pave the way for government to impose mandatory vaccination on all Vincentians. So it is not just public sector workers. The potential is here for all Vincentians to be impacted by these changes. Given the seriousness of the amendments, one would have thought that there would be some consultation with the different organizations tasked with representing public officers and even workers in the private sector. But instead of dialogue and its extensive consultation, what we got is an authoritarian approach with no regards for constitutional freedom of Vincentians. Nearby, in our sister island of Barbados, we see a complete contrast to this approach. Prime Minister Mia Mottley is also considering mandatory vaccination, but her approach is what we can call people-centered. The Prime Minister of Barbados has decided on having a series of consultations on the way forward. Although she's hoping for a consensus among members of the tripartite body, she recognizes the difficult and challenging issue of COVID-19 vaccination and testing. She said that the Attorney General will prepare or have prepared a legal opinion at both civil and criminal liability, looking at both civil and criminal liability with respect to aspects of mandatory vaccination and mandatory testing or failure thereto, and the consequences of engaging in a way that may cause harm to others. And that is important. She has recognized that these vaccines, which have not been granted approval but are experimental and has been granted emergency use because of the pandemic, she has recognized the potential to do harm, because the vaccine makers themselves don't even know the effect it is going to have on anyone a few years from now. She went on to say that when she would have gotten an opinion, it will trigger a process that involves both sectorial and national consultations in the ensuing weeks. And you could see the sharp contrast between what Barbados government, how they are approaching this, and how our government in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is approaching this. This approach by our government was and is deliberate. In June of this year, Finance Minister Kamala Gonsalves said the carrot and stick approach must be explored before turning to mandatory COVID-19 vaccination. And there is this, and he said, and there is this stick where people are fired if they don't vaccinate. Those are his words. If they don't vaccinate, they're fired. When people don't get promoted, if you're not vaccinated, where people don't get promoted, they're not eligible for promotions. All of that is based on vaccinations. Where the government says they are not going to hire new workers if those new workers are not vaccinated, or you're not allowed, if you're a taxi driver, to pick up people at the airport or pick up people at the cruise ship port. And these are sort of punitive actions that you take for people who are not vaccinated. I think you have to go through the first step. Those were his words. So even back then in June, it was well thought out where they wanted to go with this mandatory vaccination. The Prime Minister, at the same time, stated that an employer can inform the employees that if the COVID-19 vaccine is not taken, you may be terminated, but they have to be reasonable in terms of notice. So for instance, he said, the state as an employer, the central government, and the advice which we have received is that you will be given a reasonable notice period. Say, listen, we are planning to have persons at this or that in this work environment vaccinated, and that will make the vaccines accessible to you. Whether it's a 2-week period you get or a 4-week period in which this is going to be done. And if you refuse to take it, the vaccine, you will be considered that this is an act of misconduct, and acts of misconduct may lead to your dismissal, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves said. It was quite clear back then what the intention really was. And so it just needed changes to the Public Health Act to try and make whatever, all of this, their intention to ensure that what they're doing is legal. The PSU is not opposed to vaccination. Let me make that very clear. We are not anti-vax, but what we are is pro-free choice. We believe that every worker or person has a right to decide on being vaccinated or not. We support those workers who have made the choice to be vaccinated. Likewise, we also support the workers who have not made that choice for whatever reason. They may have decided and are still deciding not to. Whether those reasons be religious, whether they be medical, whatever they be as a result of their freedom of conscience, whether they are just waiting to see what is going to happen. They are uncertain. And there are a lot of persons, of course, who are unsure and are still waiting before they can make their minds up. It is our position, that is the Public Service Union, that compulsory vaccination is a step too far. Vaccination must remain voluntary. And let me reiterate that we support vaccination, but mandatory vaccination is not the answer. It is also our view that the most effective approach is to encourage our members to make informed decisions. If workers, we believe, if workers are properly educated on this matter, they will make whatever decision they wish to make in the best interest of them and their families. These amendments must be resisted with every fiber in our being. They pose a present danger to all workers and to our children. The amendment even placed decision regarding our health in the hands of the CMO. Because if the reasons that you are going to give for not wanting to take the vaccine are medical reasons, not even your doctor, who will know your medical history, has the final say. In the current act, your doctor has the final say. Given the amendments, if they are passed, that will not be a doctor's decision, you and your doctor's decision. That decision will finally rest with the CMO, who know very little about you medically. There are persons who cannot take this experimental drug for all sorts of different reasons. All sorts of different reasons. I want you to imagine, and I'm looking at the children, because the children who are exempted in the current act. But given the amendments and that section has been struck out, they are no longer exempted. So just imagine your 12 or 14-year-old son or daughter being mandated to take a vaccine that not even the manufacturers can tell you if possible side effects would occur 2 or 3 years down the road. The people of this country must demand that government withdraw the proposed amendments to the Public Health Act. The people, every single Vincentian, will be touched by these amendments if they are allowed to become law. Whether you are vaccinated or you are not vaccinated, because it has the potential to affect your children. School is expected to reopen sometime in September, October. If this law passes, you may very well find that your total aspirants, all children entering school, whether it is the level college or Form 5 or whatever form, must be vaccinated before they can enter. That is a strong possibility because the exemptions for children will be removed if this amendment takes effect. I wish to call on all public workers, all persons within the private sector, workers in the statutory corporations, the minibus drivers, the taxi operators, the vendors, the parents, the church leaders. And the church leaders are not exempted because if possible, you could told that you can be told that to have a certain numbers. In fact, I think this was done previously. You have to be vaccinated to have certain numbers in church. I call on all of these groups, all Vincentians, to stand in defense of your right to choose what goes into your bodies and the bodies of your young children. Join us in protest action outside Parliament on Thursday, the 5th, 2 days from today. We must send a resounding no to the government, the parliamentarians in the House who wish to support these amendments. If you never stand for anything else in your entire life, I submit to you, this is one issue that you need to stand for. You cannot put your life, the life of your children, the life of the elderly, cannot put their health in the hands of a government who has no regard and has demonstrated no regard for the opinion of persons affected by these changes. The WHO, when they speak to COVID-19 compulsory vaccination and ethical issues, they said, if you're giving consideration to such, the voices of the persons affected must be heard. This current government has every intention of going to Parliament and making these amendments without any input from the entire country that is going to be impacted negatively from this decision. We cannot allow that to happen. And everyone needs to speak clearly. The power of the people is greater than the people in power. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bouter. And we're going to have Mr. Smith doing his presentation at this time.
Honorable Israel Bruce, the lawyer for the Police Welfare Association, lawyers Thomas and Barnwell, representing the teachers and public service unions, my fellow colleagues, President Boucher of the Public Service Union and Robertson of the Teachers Union, members of the media, fellow officers, especially from the rank of from constable to inspector, other members, good afternoon. We are at a crossroad in our democracy and freedom of choice and that of consent. I have carefully read the drafted amended document that is expected to come on the floor of our Parliament this Thursday. This amendment threatens our basic human and fundamental rights. Many of you have expressed, and I'm referring to the officers, serious concerns about the issue of compulsory vaccination or the government's latest proposal that basically will give the chief medical officer certain amended powers as to whether you should subject yourselves to any particular test or any particular treatment. What is currently before us now is that this law is applicable to COVID-19 pandemic, and the consideration to which this amendment could be applicable to and would be the testing for COVID-19 and the vaccination that is associated therewith. Colleagues, whilst today the issue of consideration is COVID-19, we don't know what tomorrow, next week, next month, or even next year holds. The law, as it is crafted, now is not speaking singly to COVID-19, but rather to contagious diseases. As former Commissioner of Police Osborne Crowe would often say, do what is right and fear no man. Fellow officers, I urge you to follow your conscience and continue to seek professional medical advice from your doctor. Do not be intimidated by anyone, regardless of who they think they are. Officers, if there have never been a time when we stood for anything in our lives, this is the time. This vaccine cannot be a one-fit-all. I had the opportunity to speak with a female member of our organization. And she expressing that she was advised to take the family planning And as she was doing so, she realized that her teeth began to get black. And then she said, it came off of it, and then she was okay. I'm saying this because if we think that the vaccine is going to work for all of us, I can tell you, we are telling ourselves a big lie. The PM some time ago, before he said that he took the vaccine, when asked about whether he will take the vaccine or not, or if he has taken it, he indicated that he was praying about it. But I am telling you today, because we are a Christian nation, many Vincentians are still praying about it today. And we must allow them the chance to continue to pray about it. This, I tell you, my fellow colleagues, my fellow Vincentians, let us do this together, because there may not be a tomorrow with this. Thank you very much, and anticipate any questions from the media after. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And we are going to entertain Mr. Robinson at this time when he gonna make his presentation.
Pleasant good evening, brothers and sisters, distinguished colleagues around the head table, educators of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our hardworking teachers, parents, students, members of the media, those of you who are listening this very important press conference. I want to begin by quoting from the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Section 9(1) that deals with protection of freedom of conscience. It says, except with his own consent, a person shall not be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of conscience, including freedom of thought and of religion, freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and both in public and in private. As we examine what the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is about to do, as have been already established by my two other colleagues, President from the Public Service Union, Chairman of the Police Welfare Association. We are examining exactly in a critical way the amendments which the government intends to make come Thursday to the Public Health Act and the Public Officers Act. The intention is clear from the standpoint of the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines that the government intends to hinder our enjoyment of our freedom of conscience. And this is trampling upon a fundamental right. I also want to link this as a racial issue also, because the majority of people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you're either Kalinago, you're Garifuna, and to some extent from those who came here as indentured servants. And so when we look at various pieces of instruments that the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines would have ratified it begs the question, at this point in time, is either the government is short of memory or something is totally wrong. Because you cannot sign on to these instruments on one hand, and on the other hand, you turn back and you want to deny the peoples of St. Vincent and the Grenadines of their rights. When we examine Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it speaks to the very issue that the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is tampering with, and that is the right to freedom of thoughts and of conscience. And Article 19 also went on in detail to speak about that right. St. Vincent and the Grenadines also would have ratified the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this document was passed on the 15th of June, 2016. And Article 13 also speaks to the right to recognition. It went on to speak about your spirituality, your practices, your beliefs, your values. St. Vincent and the Grenadines also would have ratified the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 12 speaks to the issue of the right to manifest, to practice, to develop, to teach your spiritual and your religious traditions. The point I'm making is that we still have persons in our communities who continue to hold on to their traditions from their ancestors. It's part of their belief systems. There are certain traditional medicines which are used, which people today continue to use to maintain and sustain their health. Why would you want to deprive such persons of continuing with these healthy traditional medicines and to force them to take a vaccine that is still in its experimental stages? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a unilateral decision by the state. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, again, would have forgotten that they have signed on to the decent work agenda, which is one of the issue, one of the standard in CARICOM. You have failed to have social dialogue with the trade unions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In fact, in April of this year, we had a meeting with the Prime Minister and other members of his cabinet, and we were promised this policy. Up to now, we have not received it. We are still waiting. We are still open to dialogue. But you have failed. Now you're heading to the House of Parliament to amend this very important piece of legislation to mandate that we take a vaccine or vaccines into our bodies. And these have not received the authorization from the reputable organizations. I want to remind the teachers of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the educators, the members of the Teachers Union, that in April, at our annual general meeting, I want to remind you of the decision. The decision that if the government makes vaccination mandatory, we must resort to industrial action. This is still our position. It has not been changed. So I'm reminding our teachers that this is the time to stand up and to stand tall. And I know many of you are Christians. The good book, the Bible says, who do you ought to obey? Is it God or is it man? God has given you the right to your conscience, the right to choose. So who are you going to obey now? Man or God? I am calling on you to utilize the opportunity that you have now to stand up for your fundamental rights and freedom. I also want to remind you that in our Constitution, you have the freedom of expression. You have a right to assemble with your trade union and to demonstrate in a peaceful way. It is not anything illegal. It is something that is normal. And so we call on you to support the protests, a worthy cause, not only for ourselves, but for future generations to come. Brothers and sisters, Vincentians, this is the time you have to stand up as Joseph Svgtu and many of the liberators in that century who have fought and fought manfully for a just cause. This is a time that we must rally together and stand together with one voice, with one determination. Let us kill the bill. We need to kill this bill. And when we kill this bill, we would have the right to exercise the right to conscience, the right to freedom of choice. It's more than just having an idea, an opinion. You'd be able to demonstrate it, to exercise it, and to share it with others. So I want to join with my other colleagues. I call out the church leaders because this thing is also directly pointed at you. The taxi drivers, the minibus operators, and I want to use this opportunity to commend those minibus operators who came out and supported the last action. This is just the beginning. The market vendors, the fisher folks, wherever you are today, when your neighbor's house is on fire, what you have to do? Wet your own. We must rally together and save our nation, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, by standing up and deepening our democracy, and in doing so, protecting our fundamental rights and freedom. Let us uphold our Constitution and let us stand together and fight a good fight of faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Robbie. Well, we have heard the police and we have heard the teachers and we heard generally from Public Service Union. I am not sure if I should be calling out my nurses. That's just by the way. So thank you, leaders of the various organizations. And at this time, we are going to be hearing from the lawyers what the law has to say, and they are going to be dissecting the proposed amendments and the amendment from previous time. Ladies first. Okay. We'll start with Mr. Bruce.
I'm getting accustomed to the new technology. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. First of all, I'd like to greet my colleagues at the head table, Presidents Boucher and Robinson of the PSU and Teachers Union, President Smith, Police Welfare Association, my instructing person, my colleagues Thomas and Barnwell, representing PSU and teachers. Suffice it to say that the laypersons at the head table have done indeed an incredible job at looking at the proposed amendments. It says that the lawyers deserve their fees. They have properly explained the consequences of these changes to the leadership of the organizations. Be that as it may, first of all, the proposed public health amendment that will be on the floor of Parliament on Thursday, God's willing, seeks primarily, as it is positioned, look at it on the bare surface of the document that is presented. One would realize that you have to look a little deeper to get that profound understanding of the application and the implication of that piece of amendment. Because on the surface it says that Section 27B of the Public Health Act, referred to in this act as the Principal Act, is deleted and the following section inserted. So the first thing you would have to do is go to see what is deleted. And what is deleted is this, that 27B says the following persons are exempt from orders made under Section 27A, 3, G, and H. Therefore, for you to get an appreciation of that, you must then flip across to Section 27A, subsection 3, paragraphs G and H. 27A of the Public Health Act, Cap 300. Remember, this amendment was done in the year 2020, so just last year. The previous act existing was amended. 27, it says, where a health officer is of the opinion on reasonable and probable grounds that, I will go down to subsection 3, without limiting subsection 1, an order made under this section may, then we go across to paragraph G, may require the persons to whom the order is directed to submit to an examination by a medical practitioner who is acceptable as, to a health officer, and to deliver to the health officer a report by the medical practitioner as to whether or not the person has a communicable disease or is not infected with an agent of a communicable disease. Let's look at that very briefly. So G is saying it was requiring the person to whom an order is directed to submit to examination, testing, essentially, and therefore to have that tested done by someone who is acceptable as or to a health officer. And then H, that's paragraph H, says that it requires the person to whom the order is directed in respect of a communicable disease to place himself forthwith under the care and treatment of a medical practitioner who is acceptable to a health officer. Now, what the proposed section seeks to do is that it says in this reading that a person who is exempt from an order under section 27A3H and H, this is the proposed amendment, if the person produces a certificate signed by a medical practitioner approved by the chief medical officer certifying that the medical treatment for the prevention or cure of the disease is not advisable on medical grounds. I'll tell you my understanding of that very profoundly. Is that if you have, or if you believe that you're suffering from a particular disease, and you go to see your medical doctor, your medical doctor may then decide that based on his or her understanding of your medical history, that a particular test, that you should not subject yourself to a particular test, or that your body should not be subjected to a particular treatment. This proposed amendment is saying that even if your medical doctor, to which there is the doctor-client confidentiality, comes to the professional conclusion that this is the case for his or her client, that must then be certified by the chief medical officer. And I am not making any statement that is untoward, that speaks to the chief medical officer in any disparaging way. But in essence, this proposed amendment almost creates a super doctor for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It suggests that the state bears little regard for the professional and ethical positions of practitioners in the state. They're suggesting, in my mind, that practitioners could come to the conclusion that a frontline worker, because we have to build it in context, a frontline worker, a government frontline worker, or a frontline worker for that matter, generally, who has been declared by his or her medical practitioner not a fitting person to undergo a particular testing or to undergo particular treatment, unless the CMO certifies that, look, I accept this, then it renders itself unacceptable. And therefore, whatever your medical practitioner concludes becomes an opinion for the garbage heap, in essence. Well, the nice speakers, like my colleague to my immediate left, would say null and void. I would say it so that the ordinary man understands what I'm saying. Null and void might not be so clear. But that is essentially what it means. So the Chief Medical Officer of Health must also be on top of your information as regards your health status. It would no longer be that confidential relationship between you and a medical doctor of your choice. So that choice issue, that constitutional issue of choice becomes questionable. That issue of you being able to go to your own medical professional and that professional exhibiting and determining how you should be dealt with, that is not your position finally, unless it is certified by the CMO. I don't know if it is that the state is saying that they don't trust the medical practitioners in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to come to proper conclusions. I would not want to believe that that is what the state is suggesting. So that is for me, the major issue, or one of the major issues that one could readily see inside of this particular piece. And then we had, of course, an attempt by one of the legal luminaries in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as many we regard, in a statement of the 3rd of July, 2021, in which it was indicated that this has nothing to do with, mandatory vaccination. So that is what we were told. That is what was explained to us in that important article that we all saw not too long ago. And so for that reason, I want to have a very brief look at it so that persons could understand that article or that piece of writing. And I go to try and read it for you, some part of it very quickly so I can put it in context. It says, the common law imposes on the government of a duty to take reasonable care to protect the health of and safety of its employees and others. As part of its duty, the government has to ensure that any place in which an employee works is safe. This is particularly relevant in the current circumstances of a pandemic and for the duration of the declared public health emergency. It goes on. In order to honor this duty, so that, in other words, so that we can protect all these employees, the government will by rules to be made under the Public Health Act, impose a requirement for vaccination with at least the first dose in the case of a vaccine that requires 2 doses on those public sector employees who have been employed to work in the workplaces the government considers to be high-risk environment. These frontline employees would be exempt from the requirement for vaccination on 2 grounds. This is the important part. This is why I read this part. They will be exempted on 2 grounds. First, on the ground that the vaccination is not advisable on medical grounds. The first ground is that it is not advisable on medical grounds. But who makes that final determination if it is advisable? Not your medical doctor. The ultimate final position on whether or not it is advisable falls in the lap of the chief medical officer. So she may agree with your medical officer, or she may disagree with your medical officer. And if she disagrees, it means therefore what? That you simply will have to subject yourself to the testing and the vaccination. And mind you, I am speaking to this not singly within the context of COVID, but within the context of anything that falls in line with COVID, whether now, next year, 2 years from now, what have you. And then he goes on to say, secondly, if the employee objects in good faith, that the vaccination is contrary to his religious beliefs, and the employee is able to make alternative arrangements to accommodate the employee. What does that mean? Really, what does that mean? So it's some sort of Gonzalez brilliance, I may call it, but what does it mean? If the employee, on religious grounds, in a sense it is saying, decides that, look, I'm objecting to taking this based on my religious belief. He said, in good faith. So who determines that you are taking this religious position, that you are opposing the taking of or subjecting yourself to a series of tests or treatments, and that you're doing it in good faith? So your good faith determination becomes something that is to be examined accordingly. It is no longer conscience, it is no longer rights. You see what it is reduced to good faith according to this particular piece of pronouncement. I would say that in truth and in fact, that all of this that has been put in this document here helps to echo one single thing to my mind, an important conversation I heard between 2 distinguished Vincentians, Ralph E. Gonzalez and Stephen Joachim, whether or not employers would send at home the employees, send them home from work if they refuse to subject themselves. And the answers that you got was the head of government essentially pointing out to an employer how you can make an employed person unemployed in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That was the essence of the response. That to me was most amazing. But let me say this. Police officers are going to be at the front line of every and many issues in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. If there's a call for police officers to respond to a murder scene, he or she, as an officer, simply has to take the instructions of the senior officers giving the instructions, put on their protective gears, and get to the front line of that possible murder scene. If it is a robbery, the same thing has to happen. the police officers in this country simply have to inject themselves at the front line to respond to criminal situations. We are saying, and I'm saying, that the police officers, like every Vincentian, are entitled to the protection under the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You're entitled to select your own medical practitioner and to ensure that the confidentiality between your practitioner and yourself is properly determined and sustained. What you don't want to have happening is that your medical practitioner, corporal, that your medical practitioner, constable, that your medical practitioner, sergeant, makes a determination that a particular test or treatment is not good for you. But the CMO says, I don't agree with this conclusion arrived at by your medical practitioner, and I'm therefore determining that you are indeed to subject your body to this treatment. You are indeed going to subject yourself to this particular treatment, not just the testing, but the treatment. And the implications thereafter are yours. That freedom to choose dissipates. We all police officers in this country want to make sure that whatever is done by the state machinery is done to the extent that we protect, of course, the sociological realities of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the economic realities of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and to ensure that there's a delicate balance between them both. Because officers know that if the economy is to collapse, then the state would not be in a position to be able to pay their salaries. They would not be able to service their mortgages, and so forth and so on. So the officers, the police officers in this country are not dumb. Police officers in this country, they're not silly. They are quite aware of these attendant realities. But in the same context, they must not be treated as dumb and silly when it comes to making a determination as to whether or not they subject themselves to particular sets of testing and or treatment under any legislation. In essence, that choice is in a very subtle way being taken from you, and it is presented, oh, well, it is about immunization, and the law already provides for inoculation, and that is the road to distract that has been employed. But as I said, and I did a while ago, I read on that same article, and you can see where essentially its ultimate objective is to ensure that, look, once you are a frontline worker, and then it comes to the exemption, one of that exemption issue has to be with your medical practitioner, and then your medical practitioner can have their position sustained, or they could have it been dumped, as I said, in the garbage heap. That is a serious issue for police officers, and you have to determine as police officers whether or not you ultimately subject yourself to the testing and put the vaccination into your bodies as it relates to COVID now or any other disease in the future, and how do you protect your children, your wives and your husbands, your boyfriends and girlfriends, your grandma and your grandpa, because ultimately that entire circle could be affected based on the decision you take as a police officer. Mind you, officers, that we are not suggesting in any way that you must be stiff-necked about what you should do. We continue to say, endear yourself to the available information that is out there. Read the pros and the cons and make your own sensible determination. And once you've arrived at the spot where you think you're satisfied that you so wish to subject your body, then by all means go ahead. If you're satisfied that having read what you read and having learned what you learned, that you do not wish to, we're saying that you should not be, by any amendment to any legislation, be forced to subject yourself to any testing or any treatment that could have significant negative implications on you and your family in the future. And the Police Welfare Association, I would say with the authority of Mr. Smith, stand resolutely to support the police officers, whether you decide not to or if you decide that you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. For those who are listening and watching, don't forget you can submit your questions and we will try to address them as much as possible at the end of the session. So at this time, we would hear from Ms. Banwell.
A very pleasant good evening to everyone who is listening to this live broadcast. I want to pick up from where Councillor Bruce left off on this point of the exemption with respect to medical grounds and the concerns or certain things that are raised there. So what is not clear in the amendment, what's not clear in the Act in any case, is that it doesn't provide any guidance on how the CMO will certify the health conditions of the person seeking the exemption on the medical grounds. I think Councillor Bruce has basically addressed those issues, and I won't go over them in any detail, but to simply say that when my medical doctor or your medical doctor say that I have a particular medical condition, and I must also say at the same time, it is also a good thing in a way that the Act does not provide a list of medical conditions that it will say these are the list of conditions upon which someone will be exempted from taking a medical treatment or particular type of care with respect to COVID-19. The other question that I have that is raised is that if the CMO says that I am not in agreement and I need to have more tests done, or this medical report is inadequate and additional costs will be incurred, who covers the cost? I figure once I am seeking something, I figure that that additional cost will rest with the person seeking the medical exemption. The other thing that I want to raise is that it doesn't state whether or not if the CMO does not agree or rejects the medical conditions outlined by your medical officer, whether there is an appeal process or you can lay an objection against the CMO's final decision. That is also not clear in the amendment, given that this is the only exemption now that the Act covers. Having said that, I just want to briefly go up to say it is true when the Prime Minister says that the amendment does not state that the immunization program that is established by the CMO is not mandatory. But what it does do is that it removes the power of the citizen to exercise his or her choice by putting that discretionary power in the minds and the hands of the CMO and the minister. That is what it does. So it says before quite clearly that it was voluntary, and it means that it takes away your power and places that power, that right, in the hands of the CMO or the minister to make that decision, that discretion. And why I say discretion, I want to tie it again with the exemption, because the exemption is simply saying again that the CMO is the one who makes the final decision as to whether or not you qualify for an exemption. I also want to say that in February 2021, it was gazetted 11th of February 2021, whereby the vaccination program was established on the Act number 6 of 2021. And it does say that at that time, which is going to be changed soon, that was a voluntary immunization program. I want to also say, because what I'm going to do here after very briefly is to tie into what everyone says, listen to the experts, because this particular vaccination program is being established under the WHO declaration that there is an outbreak of COVID-19. We all know that. And we also want to point out that it says public health emergency authorization of COVID vaccine rules 2021, where it lists in that the vaccines to be used in the treatment and prevention of COVID-19. We know them: Moderna, Pfizer, Sputnik, AstraZeneca, Johnson Johnson, and Covishield. In St. Vincent at this time, and what has been used so far, AstraZeneca, Sputnik, and I do understand, as has been advertised, that Pfizer will be coming here. And the reason why I mention this is that if we are acknowledging that this vaccination program is being established under emergency authorized use, which I'm going to go straight to WHO, and we like to say we should follow the exports. I want to address just 2 points. One that was raised and picked up, I think, by President Boucher, whereby he mentioned one of the exemptions under the current act would qualify children or wards. And I want to mention this because it really, just this afternoon when Jim and I were looking at it again, I said, but wait, they're taking out that exemption for children. And that has been a debate that's going on internationally because right now in the UK, they are not giving anyone under 18 who they qualify as children this vaccination, saying that they do not believe that the benefits to be gained actually, no, that the risk, that the benefits are, there are no benefits that actually to be gained by vaccinating children with respect to the community interest. That's a paraphrase. So I have looked at, and I think this has been going around and it's on the WHO side. And this particular document says COVID-19 and mandatory vaccination, ethical considerations and caveats, policy briefing dated April 13, 21. And I don't think, as far as I know, that this has changed. I am not going to read the entire thing. It's a very long document, but I would encourage people who are looking to be able to make that informed consent to have a look at it in making your decisions. It talks about in schools. It says, given the lack of data on safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines for children, COVID-19 vaccines have not yet been authorized for this population. I know some countries are seeking authorization for it. The United States has already been vaccinating children. Consequently, vaccination is not currently ethically justified as a condition for attending school. Once such data are available and show favorable safety and efficacy in this population, policymakers will have to consider whether mandating vaccination as a condition of attending school is necessary and proportional to achieve the public health objectives. In bracket, it talks about those ethical considerations that it's imploring governments to consider, and whether this could undermine public trust. In some jurisdictions, vaccination against the virus that cause a number of diseases. And why I'm saying this as well, I know there has been this talk and a comparison of this COVID-19 vaccine with vaccines that we were all given, most of us were given as children. And this is what it says. In some jurisdictions, vaccination against the viruses that cause a number of diseases, example, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, is a condition for attending school or receiving state-sponsored entitlement. However, mandates for routine pediatric vaccines are distinct from vaccines authorized for emergency use in many respects, including the relatively limited and evolving evidence for COVID-19 vaccines, in addition to uncertainty regarding herd immunity and new SARS-CoV-2 variants in the context of COVID-19. There's our caution. I want to move on to health workers. This is what it says. This mandatory vaccination is perhaps most often discussed in the context of health and social care, particularly where health workers have a direct contact with the population of high-risk SARS-CoV-2 infection or severe illness or death resulting from COVID-19. Says because of, it gives the examples, and it says because of the unique setting in which health workers and their ethical obligation not to harm their patients. Moreover, COVID-19 vaccination might appear to be particularly plausible for health workers, given that vaccination of this population might be seen as necessary to protect health system capacity. That's an ethical consideration. And because health workers are commonly identified as a priority group for vaccination, meaning there is more likely to be sufficient supply to meet the needs of this population. whether a mandate for health workers is necessary and proportionate and would not undermine trust might depend on the local context and should be investigated empirically before a mandate is considered for this population. I think what is key here, and I think the union is calling for that, there's absolutely no vaccine whatsoever for Vincentians. I think what needs to be considered, one is the local context in which we live, as we have no time to discuss this today. The collaboration and discussion and dialogue with the healthcare workers, the unions, in terms of how we move forward, that is important because part of what we don't want to do, and I agree with the WHO, and even for our own democracy and our own governance, is that you do not want to degrade, erode public trust. Once we get there, we have serious issues, not only just in St. Vincent, but anywhere else where we are considering this. And before I move, I give Jomo the microphone, I want to say this. Most of what my concerns and the union concern has to do with, one, medical freedom and informed consent. I think that is basically what is being asked for. Not trying to bribe someone with a bottle of Bailey's, $100, or some ridiculous, insulting gift packaged to say, come and take the jab. That is unethical, is of the greatest unethical behavior that any government or any company can do. That is not informed consent. And informed consent is very much important. I think it's something that we take for granted in some of these parts. And I think we take it for granted sometimes because medical negligence in this past basically gets nowhere. And if more Vincentians, when they go to the doctor, say, before I take this medicine, before I undertake this medical procedure, I want you to outline to me in a very transparent manner what it is I gain and what are my consequences and risk for undertaking this particular medical intervention. We have to know all of the benefits and know all of the consequences. And one of the ways in which the government, and I do know that legally, when we talk about balancing rights, when we have issues, you balance in the public health issues against individual rights. And that's where the fine balance is. I'm also saying when it comes to informed consent, the person who is confronted with having to undertake or being forced to take a medical intervention has to balance too what are the benefits and the consequences as it relates to me. The data is saying that, and I know this is being used as part of scaremongering, and we have to really throw all of that away and look at what the facts are if we're going to be transparent and want to gain public trust. The facts are simple. They're on the CDC site. It talks about who are at high risk for severe illness, which is developing the COVID-19 disease, as well as it says who are at high risk of death. It doesn't say the general population. So when we talk about the context and the facts, we need to be able to sit down with our people, with our health practitioners, with everybody, and be able to have a really logical, reasoned discussion of what it is in the Vincentian context or even the Caribbean context, how we deal with COVID-19. Now, the last thing I want to say is this. While we are forcing, while we're saying it's not, you're not taking away voluntariness, but the manner in which it's done backdoor, it is forcing. The question I want us to consider and each employee to consider and to pose to the employer, whether it is the private employer or the state, whether the employer is guaranteeing the employee that if an employee suffers from an adverse effect now, sooner or later, and this can be connected to the emergency use vaccine, where that employer will be liable for the personal injury and loss of the employee. That's a question that needs to be answered. Because we do know that the manufacturers cannot be sued. We do not know yet, in part of informed consent, what is the status of this and whether the government then becomes immune from suit for any adverse effects suffered by anyone. And as we all know, that, and as the WHO has said there on its side, because of the nature of the treatment and the vaccine and how it's being operated and how it's administered now, and the manner in which it has been established, it is a given fact. I'm not, anybody says, oh, it's not experimental, when this and what's not. We do not know what will be any long-term effects from this. We don't know. And I figure we'll say, well, you took it back then, and we don't know, we still don't know, but you're suffering from certain things that it is that a doctor may say, and then it comes on again to a debate on experts, which is exactly what's going to happen between the CMO and your private practitioner. And that's why I asked the question as to whether this act gives any guidance. If your CMO disagrees with the conclusion reached by your medical practitioner, whether you have any right of objection and whether that is the final say.
Well, that's a fairly exhaustive set of presentations, I thought, from everyone on this podium. And I want to say that the act which comes up for discussion and possible passage on Thursday is probably one of the most significant piece of legislations that would come before the House of Assembly. And all of us should pay close attention, read, and try to come to a conclusion, discuss it with our friends, discuss it with our colleagues. Now, we know that the act, the previous act, the existing act, made an exemption for children or ward. And we know that the proposal that's coming on Thursday intends to delete that protection for children. We also know that the British government, which have many more scientists and research institutions than St. Vincent and the Grenadines, has said that these vaccines are not yet sure that they are suitable for children. Yet, when we see what I perceive to be a very sinister move, to remove that protection in the current act, it tells me that the government is probably thinking and we will force our children to undergo vaccination unless people make a strong roar to say, not my child. So that's something that I think citizens across the board has to pay attention and look at. Then there's this section 43D. And I know some of this was covered, but I just want to pull it all together again, where the suggestion is to remove the word voluntary. Now, this SRNO, which was done, SRNO number 6 of February 2021, inserted the word voluntary. Now, this government will have to say to us what has happened in the last 6 months that necessitates it removing the word voluntary from the immunization program. I know Prime Minister Gonzalez has said that common law allows for a safe and healthy workplace. I know he has said statutory law allows for it, and therefore, in fact, he says recently that the law currently allows for mandatory vaccination. That is a very broad, expansive reading of that law. Because what that law says is that the minister, in confronting a particular emergency, may have a whole series of things he or she may do, including an immunization and vaccination program. But all of the things that that Act of 1977 allows for has to come back to the constitutional mandate. And the constitutional mandate says that whatever the government does has to be reasonably required. whatever the government does has to be necessary in order to ensure that its purpose is carried out. Whatever the government does has to be proportionate. This government talks, you hear all the time they talk, oh, the Constitution said there are exceptions once it's reasonable. Of course, there are exceptions to these constitutional dictates. But reasonable is not an arbitrary term. It is not an arbitrary term. It is a term that has very tight strictures. And you cannot just willy-nilly say that this is arbitrary or this is not arbitrary. And not only that, a lot of it time you hear them talk about, oh, this is in keeping or in response to a pandemic. Yes, it is true that there is a declared pandemic. The question has to be, in looking at what is reasonably necessary and proportionate, is what is the country's specific reality in establishing reasonableness or necessity. It cannot be that because there's an explosive situation in Vanuatu, in the Pacific Ocean, that we have to respond in the same way. Or because Boston is exploding or Calgary is exploding, that we have to respond in the same way. Because just as in economics, every one size don't fit all, is the same thing holds in health. So those are the hurdles, those are the legal constitutional hurdles that this government would have to overcome. Reasonableness, necessity, and proportionality. Then there's the issue of the constitutional rights of our people, where the government seemed to be saying that the only right you have now, based on what it took out, because if you notice, it took out this whole thing about the religious right, and then the Prime Minister came back and said, if you can establish religious right in good faith, but you're taking it out of the act. But if you can, so what that is, in his public statement, what he is doing is opportunistically genuflecting to the religious sector of our society. But in essence, he's taken out from the act what the protection which they had. And in fact, he's taken that out as if to say that there's not a constitutional protection. But there is a constitutional protection under Section 9, the right to conscience, which includes freedom of thought and freedom of religion. So those are the things that I think we need to flag. Now, the removal of 43D, there's something even more sinister, you know, and it goes back to what Mr. Bruce said. It is an attempt, when you remove the word voluntary, it is really, in essence, giving carte blanche, giving the go-ahead to the private sector to do what the government may not be able to do across the board. So you may recall a few weeks ago, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, on the Issue at Hand program, the Prime Minister proudly declared to one of the major private sector persons in this country that, look, he literally tell them what to do. Make sure you give the notice, make sure you do this, make sure you do that. And more than that, if you need more, I would go back to Parliament and ensure it's done. And that is what he's doing now by the removal of the word voluntary. And how is this? How is this in keeping with good governance best practices? It is clear that we have a deficit of good governance best practice. Because look at the contrast that is happening 100 miles to our east in Barbados. And over the weeks, I've been commending the Barbadian government for its approach in this question. When certain people were saying that the private sector can change the rules of the game and fire people, the Mia Motley administration said, hold up, no employee in Barbados could do that. You can't change the rule of the game midway. Last week, Prime Minister Mia Mottley said, I'm going to ask for an Attorney General's reference. And after that reference is done, I'm going to have extensive consultation with major stakeholders. With whom has this government had consultation? Except for attempting to dictate and to arrogate itself, to move against the rights, the constitutionally protected rights of the people in the face of dealing with a pandemic. None of us are against taking safety measures. There's no teacher, there's no against taking safety methods to deal with this, this medical problem. But it must not be done. It must not be done at the expense of the constitutionally protected rights and freedoms of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
All right, thank you so very much again, Brother Thomas. I just want to very quickly now turn to the second component that I've been asked to address, that having to deal with the Medical Officers Act. As you're aware, that is the other act that is proposed to be amended come Thursday in the House of Parliament. In that proposed amendment, the government proposes to amend that act, Section 14 of that act. And let me tell you what Section 14 of that act says. First of all, let me give you the backdrop. You recall that not too long ago, the question has been raised about persons who are saying, look, we don't wish to take the vaccine. And the suggestion was, if you do not take the vaccine voluntarily, then you must subject yourself to be tested ever so often. And then there was a proposal that you would have to pay for those tests that you then have to do on that continuous basis to ensure that you satisfy your employers that you are free from the COVID virus. Now, the Section 14 of the Medical Officers Act, Cap 292 of the Laws of St. Vincent and the Grenadines currently reads, Section 14, subsection 1, and I want you to listen very carefully to what it says. All, A-L-L, all tests or examinations required in the interests of public health or for laborers or persons entitled to free medical aid shall be conducted at the laboratory at the hospital free of charge. Now, what has the government done? This government has a way of operating in the most sneaky of fashions. So, in the earlier parts of the proposed amendment, the proposals appears on the surface to be nothing to bother about. So, for example, it is the expansion of the facilities that can actually do these laboratory tests. So, the chief medical officer then can approve Sigma Laboratory, John's Medical Lab, and you name them, so that they can now become part of the laboratory arrangement to do the test and not just the hospital in Kingston. But the government sneakily, this is the proposed amendment. All tests, I'm reading the proposal, I'm going to the back to the OLA so you see where the difference is now. All tests, that's the proposal, in the OLA. All tests, all examinations. The old one says required in the interest of public health. The new one says required for persons entitled to free medical aid. You see what happens there? Because COVID, as it is right now, it is in the interest of public health. So therefore, it means that all those persons who the government is saying, you must get tested if you don't want to do the vaccination, this law says they must be tested free of charge. So they're now bringing in a change to this Medical Officers Act, Cap 292, to then extract from the people, the public servants, especially the frontline workers, the police and the teachers and the public servants, that if you don't want to take the vaccine as frontline workers and other frontline workers across this country, find the money to pay for it. They're now changing the law to say the state will not take the responsibility for paying for the public health interests, but you must now pay the state's bill for the public health interests of the state. That is the sneaky way in which the government has addressed this legislation. I mean, they've been so sneaky about it that if you go up earlier to another of the recommended changes, yes, the section 5 of the proposed amendment says that section 13A of the Principal Act is amended by deleting paragraph B and inserting the following paragraph. This is what paragraph 13B says. It was listed 13A. 13A lists the free services. It says no fee shall be chargeable in respect of the following categories of persons and for the following services. B, that's 13A, subparagraph B. Indigent and unemployed persons over the age of 60 years. That is what the existing law says. What is the amendment? Unemployed persons over the age of 60 years and indigent persons. It's the same thing. One is saying indigent and people and unemployed over 60. The new one is saying unemployed over the age of 60 and indigent. The extent of the sneakiness for you to look at that and say, oh, well, they only reverse the order. They'll do nothing big. But the catch is in the final leg of the amendment, where they're now denying you your entitlement under the public health interest to have those tests be done without you having to ferret the cost out of your pocket. Keep your eyes on the sneaky government.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bruce, Ms. Banwell, and Mr. Thomas. Well, we have heard from the heads of the various organizations. We have heard from the lawyers. The thing is, as was said before, we have not said to anybody that they're not supposed to take the vaccine. Don't take the vaccine. We have said, okay, you have read, you have gathered your information, you can make an informed decision. Because we are all aware of the public health benefits of vaccines generally. And the science as it relates to the vaccine for COVID-19 would have indicated to us that there are some benefits of taking the vaccine. We have heard of the WHO and the PAHO and the CDC, which are all credible organizations that we as a government and all the countries across the world would draw from in terms of formulating their policies and guidelines as it relates to the management of COVID-19 and the vaccination process. Now, even WHO, in its quest to tell us that vaccines are one of the most effective tools in protecting persons against infectious diseases such as COVID, have also considered the ethical considerations that we as a government, we as a people, should consider as well when we are thinking about mandating vaccines. I just want to read from a document briefly before we take the questions. This document is dated the 13th of April, 2021. COVID-19 and mandatory vaccination, ethical considerations, and the caveat. It's a policy brief and it's a WHO document. Now, what they're basically saying here is there are some ethical considerations that must be considered when you're thinking about mandating vaccines. So they're saying, in addition to having the relevant science or the scientific data, medical, legal, and practical considerations. These are what the country or the government should consider when they're thinking about mandating vaccines. So number one, necessity and the proportionality of vaccine. You have number two, sufficient evidence of vaccine safety, sufficient evidence of vaccine efficacy and effectiveness, sufficient supply, public trust, and ethical processes of decision making. Zita made a point a while ago in terms of who is going to compensate or who should compensate somebody who is forced to take this vaccine. There is something I just want to read on the sufficient evidence of vaccine safety. It says that, and this is if persons or countries as in St. Vincent who have proposed to make vaccines mandatory, data should be available that demonstrate the vaccine being mandatory has found to be safe in the population for whom the vaccine is to be made mandatory. Remember, there are a lot of outstanding data. There are a lot of information that we don't have yet because the vaccine is, as we know, as science say, and as the credible organizations have been telling us, there are a lot of information that is still forthcoming where the vaccine is concerned. When safety data are lacking or when they suggest the risk associated with vaccine outweighs the risk of harm without the vaccine, the mandate would not be ethically justified, particularly without allowing for reasonable exceptions, example, medical contraindication. Policymakers should consider specifically whether vaccines authorized for emergency or conditional use meet an evidentiary threshold for safety sufficiency for a mandate. In the absence of sufficient evidence of safety, there would be no guarantee that mandating vaccines would achieve the goal of protecting public health. Furthermore, safety, there would be no guarantee that mandating vaccine would achieve the goal of public health. So furthermore, coercive exposure of population to a potentially harmful product would violate the ethical obligation to protect the public from unnecessary harm when the harm the product might cause outweighs the degree of risk that might exist without the product. Even when the vaccine is considered sufficiently safe, mandatory vaccination should be implemented with no-fault compensation scheme to address any vaccine-related harm that may occur. This is important as it would be unfair to require people who experience vaccine-related harm to seek legal remedy for harm resulting from a mandatory intervention. Such compensation would depend on countries' health system, including the extent of universal health coverage and how they address harm from vaccines that are not fully licensed. And we were saying all along that the vaccines, as we know, were authorized under emergency or for conditional use. So it's a good question, and it's a valid question. If persons are going to be mandated to take this experimental drug, of which the manufacturers would have already withdrawn their liability, they're not responsible, who is going to be held accountable? Who is going to be answerable to the family or families of persons who against their religious rights or against their conscience would have not wanted to take the vaccine but was forced to take it, who is going to compensate family? So these are serious questions. And we are really hoping that public workers or public servants or the working class on a whole come out on Thursday and, according to Brother Robbie, kill the bill. So we are going to, any other point anybody else want to make before we go to the questions? The first question is to Mr. Boucher. I know at this time the climate among public servants persons are very timid in terms of coming out on the picket line. Persons don't want to speak out. Persons are afraid that they're going to be victimized or discriminated against. And so you have persons are hiding behind in the back. They don't want to be out front because they don't want it to get back to their supervisors and their employers. So somebody is asking Mr. Boucher, if they decide to come on the picket line on Thursday, how is the PSU or the Public Service Union is going to protect them?
The union has they basically have the mandate to take industrial action, and the workers who participate are protected by the Constitution itself, actually, and whatever other laws that we have, but they are protected once they respond to the call of the unions.
So there you have it. Public Service Union has your back. At this time, we want to entertain the questions from members of the media. Any questions from? Yes, Mr. Chance.
I heard the unions calling their members to protest on Thursday. I'm just trying to find out if this protest is in any way joined with the one that the opposition is organizing, or will the union be mounting a separate protest event?
The unions, it is not joined. The unions are protesting a specific issue. And in fact, you will, on Thursday, you would notice if you're there that the placards that are carried by the union will be speaking directly to this issue of the amendments and the importance of our constitutional rights. We are aware that other persons are going to be at the protest. Rise Haruna, the opposition, and it is the case that they themselves will be protesting this very amendment also. So they are all part of the intention populace, but the union will be addressing this issue specifically. We're not going to cloud it with other issues because of its single importance.
Any other questions from members of the media? No? So we can go to the questions that were asked online. And somebody asked, since the government has a duty to protect persons in the workplace, why is the OSH law not being enforced?
Well, I don't know if it's a question that the lawyers can answer. I don't sit in the executive of the government. I don't know why it's been passed in the House. It's law. I'm not sure why it's not enforced, and I can't speculate on it. Why is it enforced? I couldn't speak on that. I'm sorry.
Well, we know it's not enforced, and the unions have been calling for that act that was passed in 2017. I think that's just more than 3 years ago, to be enforced. And it's rather interesting that at times you hear the Prime Minister focus on safety in the workplace and all of that. And we have said, even within recent times, that if he's so concerned, if he's genuinely concerned about workplace safety and occupational safety and health issues, then he would go and bring into force that particular act or certain parts of it. But it has not been done. No part of it is enforced. But yet you hear the conversation about occupational safety and health act. It is one of the reasons why, I firmly believe that all of the attempts to address issues of occupational safety and health in the workplace now in the times of COVID, that is not entirely genuine. A lot of it is geared towards vaccination uptake. I mean, that is my view, basically.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. There's another question. This one is for Mr. Bruce. As a police officer who have the right to free medical at the hospital, does this mean all police can still have this privilege as it pertains to the COVID, or it means we have to pay for it?
All right, so clearly this officer has an interest based on the proposed amendment to the Medical Officers Act, as I had addressed earlier. I'd like to say to the officer that under the Police Act, Section 10 of that Act, unless the government recognizes this particular section and again, in the normal sneaky fashion seeks to amend this particular section, Section 10 subsection 1 says, all members of the force up to and including the rank of inspector shall be entitled to free medical and surgical treatment subject to such conditions as are prescribed by the regulations made under this act. So unless the regulations are amended and this particular section 10 subsection 1 is amended, then I say to members of the Police Welfare Association that this is your second of your 2 bites at the cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. There's another question for the lawyers. We can have a subordinate law to supersede the supreme law of the state. I guess they're talking about the Constitution and the Act. If you can have a subordinate law superseded the supreme law of the state. Okay. Short answer is no, according to the
Suffice it to say that we can quickly say the short answer is no and the long answer is no. There is a duty on our part to let citizens know that if any government seeks to pass any law that takes a position that is contra to the constitutional position, then you are entitled as of incention to challenge that law in the Constitutional Court. So keep in mind that you are not restricted. And for your own benefit, directly, Chapter 9 of the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Section 101, it says this Constitution is the supreme law of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And subject to the provisions of this Constitution, if any other law is inconsistent with this Constitution prevail, and the other law shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be void. This is the basis upon which you, as a citizen of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, can challenge the government in the Constitutional Court that the law that it has made is unconstitutional.
Have a question?
The long answer to that is yes. The answer to whether or not it is reality, we can't say based on how we have been practicing governance in these parts, the answer to that will be no. There's a common practice in St. Vincent and the Grenadines for members of parliament to toe particular lines. So you don't expect, let's assume that the members of the opposition benches were to vote against. The likelihood, the probability that a member on the government bench voting against that particular proposed amendment is closer to zero than anything else. So I would say, don't hang your hat waiting for it to happen.
Any more? Okay, go ahead.
Well, I thought the question was answered earlier as it relates to Section 101 of the Constitution. If the conclusion is that whatever the government is doing in whatever way violates the rights of any citizen, then that citizen can file a motion in the court that seeks redress from the court to the perceived or actual violation. So the answer is yes, you do have redress.
Another, you have any more? Somebody's asking on what grounds can they abstain from taking mandatory vaccination?
Well, currently, as it is in the legislation now, it is at section. Let me go back to the relevant section again. Section 27, section 27A, and it lists a number of categories of persons that could be exempted. But the proposal, as is now, simply saying before that order that can be made to ask you to subject yourself to testing and treatment, your medical doctor must certify that you are not a viable candidate to subject your body to that test or to undergo that treatment. The proposal is that your medical doctor taking a position now is not the end all, because the CMO, the chief medical officer, would then have to certify what your medical doctor says. And if that is not certified by the CMO, then the CMO's position becomes the position that you must subject yourself to the testing and to the treatment that is available. That is where we say that the voluntariness disappears in some regards, or in some extent, and the mandatory element of it comes into play. I don't know if Svgtu or Jomo wants to add anything. That's it.
So there's another question for the lawyers. If this amendment is done, Persons are asking if it would be used in terms of if you have to verify whether you have the vaccine or not as a requirement to get like public assistance or get treatment from the health facility or anything like that, if you see that happening.
Well, we don't know where this government would take this whole process. It, I think, depends in the end what the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines allows. Because if you give them an inch, they may take a mile. If the resistance is strong, then they may conclude that, boy, the people of St. Vincent are not allowing us to go as far as we want to go. As Mr. Bruce pointed out, we saw where the government is subtly changing the statute to ensure that they can put maximum pressure on the people so that, oh, they would say to you, this is not a mandatory vaccine, but whereas the law previously said the government will bear the cost of all medical tests in the event of an emergency, medical emergency, it is now putting that financial burden on the individual, on the worker, part of the process of ensuring. Yes, those who refuse, it would not arise otherwise.
Well, if I may say, I think what Bruce is trying to raise is the discrimination that is looming there. Because I think initially when the government spoke, it is that, and I haven't seen the policy, I believe, as Robbie said, president of the St. Vincent and the Grenadine Teachers Union, the first meeting that we had with the executive body, including the Prime Minister, at the end of it, the Prime Minister did promise the unions that he will ensure that the clear policy guidelines be sent to the unions, and that was not done. And so perhaps they're still trying to, figure it out. Because for one thing, what has been said, which I haven't seen written, is that those persons who are vaccinated will not have to pay for these tests. Those persons who are unvaccinated will have to pay these tests. And I think when we're talking about the ever-changing and evolving situation that we must consider when we think about whether things are necessary and proportionate, it is not said in some nebulous way. What are the facts on the ground? What's happening? Now, we are finding out from the CDC that it is very much likely for those persons who are fully vaccinated to transmit and contract this virus. And if that is the case, are you saying that just because I choose to exercise my freedom, health freedom to say, for whatever reason, I choose not at this particular time to have this investigational vaccine, as I said on the CDC side, that I must pay? That's a punishment. And that's part of forcing. So what Jomo has said and what Bruce is saying, even if the government is removing the word voluntary and saying it's not mandatory, the way you're boxed in is oppressive and is forcing you to take the investigational vaccine. So you have to pay for your own test. Think about it. If depending on what your paycheck is, and you choose to exercise that right, the burden falls on you to be able to, whether it's every 2 weeks, I can't recall, every 2 weeks to pay for this test. What's the cost of the test? Each test? $26, 26 EC. So you got multiplication over the period of time until this pandemic is declared over. And it's simply saying, if it is that we are going to keep this policy that was proposed initially, that those persons who are vaccinated do not have to pay for the test or are not subjected to doing the test every 2 weeks, something does not add up and doesn't make sense. Doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, Zita. Two last final questions, if no other comes before. Somebody wants to know if the amendment is passed, and there is a future pandemic, what is going to stop the government from making, well, let's say another vaccine comes on stream, that vaccine mandatory without consulting with the civil society?
Short answer is that is when the amendments are made, any law, existing law applies to whatever happens later on. This pandemic, the next pandemic, unless the laws change.
Final question. Somebody wants to know if the CMO have constitutional power over medical professionals.
All right. No, the Constitution does not give the Chief Medical Officer any authority over medical practitioners. What the statute has done is, by virtue of that position, of course, there's the medical practitioners in this country would function under the auspices of the Chief Medical Officer.
Final, any other questions from teachers or any media personnel? Okay, that one. The association as itself, as a body, did not make that decision. However, nurses who are a part of the public service union will be there, a part of the protest. Final thoughts? No? So we want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, public servants, those in the private sector, working class on a whole, for joining us in our joint press conference between the two unions and the Police Welfare Association. Thank you, our legal counsel, for being here. And we're really hoping that Thursday, being there would be, well, we would make a great impact in terms of reversing whatever proposed amendment is being put forward by the government. So thank you for coming again. Thank you for listening, for those who followed us on social media. And I hope that we would have a blessed and productive week. See you on the picket line on Thursday, God's willing. Thank you and have a pleasant evening.